Hey, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay Just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior. So I hope you are all doing well. Let's get right into it. This is a video I've been wanting to do for a while. Because I always find this subject to be really interesting. I love this part of Tolkien's lore. All right, but let's start at the beginning. All right, this is an article. Now, this article goes back a little bit, okay? It's not a new article. It's actually, I think, from back in August before season 1 of Rings of Power aired, when they were still trying to build the hype for it. But it says Bronwyn and, Arondir, Rings of Power tweaks one of Tolkien's oldest traditions. A Tolkien motif continues in Amazon's Lord of the Rings prequel series, The Rings of Power, but there's a critical tweak that makes a world of difference. In 2017, upon the posthumous publication of Tolkien's The Tale of Beren and Luthien, the New Republic writer Joe Livingstone observed the meaning of romance in J.R.R. Tolkien's famous saga, The Lord of the Rings. On The Romance of Arwen and Aragorn, Livingstone says their love, quote, gives emotional and narrative depth, unquote, to the action, while their marriage represents an, quote, everlasting bond between their two races, unquote. Romance, in fact, lies at the center of the Lord of the Rings mythology, Livingstone wrote. A romance between an elf and a mortal human continues, or technically preludes, in The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, streaming September 2nd on Prime Video, but one doesn't simply get a love story retold. In an interview with Inverse, The Rings of Power stars Ismael Cruz Cordova and Nazanin Benaidi, and again, I know I screw up their names, and I'm sorry about that, tease how the epic prequel brings a fresh spin, one centered on class and privilege, to one of Tolkien's most popular motifs, and it all happens through their respective characters, elf archer Arondir and human healer Bronwyn, whose son may be connected to evil in a way no one can imagine. But first, who are Bronwyn and Arondir? As Bonaidi tells Inverse, Bronwyn originates from the Southlands, also known as the Darkland, that lies in southeast Arda. Her ancestors chose the wrong side of history. They chose evil over good, she says, alluding to the battle between good and evil that precedes Rings of Power, and her people are now paying the price for that. The Southlands are a barren place, says Bonaidi, whose those doomed to live there have had to learn how to rebuild and regain the trust of Middle-earth's other peoples following their fall from societal respect. But Bronwyn herself isn't someone who would just choose evil. She's a healer and a single mother of a rebellious teenage son, Bonaidi says. On top of that, she is in a forbidden romance with the elf Arondir, who has been tasked with watching over her people. Ismael Cruz Cordova, who plays Arondir, playfully describes his character to Inverse as that quiet homie that doesn't give away much. You kind of have to see him to get him, Cordova says. He expresses himself through his actions. He's a soldier. He's quiet. He's a quiet, fiery guy. He's tasked with watching over the Southlanders, but is curious about these people. That curiosity leads him to fall in love with this human that shares a lot of qualities with him, like a love of nature. Cordova and Bonaidi observe major differences between their characters and Lord of the Rings Aragorn and Arwen. For one, the Rings of Power pair are peasant outsiders rather than the elite princesses and would-be kings of the world. Such disparity brings a new perspective to Tolkien's saga and rich context to the circumstances in which these lovebirds find each other. Bronwyn is, like the poor man's human, and I view Arondir as the poor elf's elf, Bonaidi says. Our union is one of our common struggle to be accepted by our own, to reach out our curiosity for the other. We're sort of grassroots people in the trenches, if you will. We have zero privilege within our kind. I think that lends itself to exploring this human-elf romance dynamic in a whole new way. In other words, it is Arondir and Bronwyn's statuses as relative outsiders that brings them together, and in the long tradition of Lord of the Rings romance, what sets their dynamic apart. They are kind of outcasts in both of their communities, Cordova echoes. There's that crack in the sidewalk that a rose or a flower rips through. That spark happens and they begin this forbidden love. That's how their love blossoms. All right, so um, let's dive into this. So one of the things that I had wanted to do a video on this was because, first of all, they sell the Bronwyn Arandir thing as forbidden love, right? Um, it. I think that misses the point in Tolkien's work. As you guys know, elf and human relationships are not inherently just forbidden, right? There is no outlawing them. They are not outlawed. Um, for me, the show missed a really great opportunity here with the whole Bronwyn Arandir thing. Insofar as they sort of just sold it as the forbidden love, elf and human, right? But they sort of, I think, in my opinion, sort of missed the whole point of Tolkien writing these elf human relationships. Now let's look at some of the other elf human relationships that we have, right? Obviously we have Beren and Luthien, okay? Um the heart of the whole thing, according to Tolkien, right? The heart of the whole thing, the story of Beren and Luthien, that was his and Edith's story within the legendarium, right? To the point where, as you guys may know, Edith, his wife, Tolkien's wife, when she passed away, on her headstone, he had engraved Luthien, right? And when he passed away, his son Christopher had engraved Beren. So on J.R.R. Tolkien's gravestone and his wife Edith's gravestone, you have the names Beren and Luthien, because a lot of that story, or the initial part of that story when they first meet, Tolkien took from how he first met his wife Edith, right? So you have that whole that story. So that's a human elf relationship. But then you have a couple of others. You have Tuor and Idril, um, who also are a human elf relationship. And you then also have Arwen and Aragorn, another human elf relationship. And that's probably the most famous one that most people know. But then you have another one that's really not very well known, and I think only because it's limited to just a few sentences. But that is Imrazor and Mithralas. Okay. The interesting thing about Imrazor and Mithralas is Imrazor. He's one of the princes of Belfalas. All right, which and is sort of like a fiefdom of Gondor, right? Um, and so he's not necessarily royalty. It's sort of like, yeah, you got some clout because you're indirectly related, right? Um, and so you have Imrazor and Mithralas is another human elf relationship, and again, Imrazor, not a king, not in line to be a king. For all intents and purposes, he's just like a normal dude. Now, they're descended from some Numenorians. There's some Numenorian blood there, but by and large, just a normal guy. Mithralas, the elf in the equation, she is not elven royalty in any way, shape, or form. As a matter of fact, she is what could be considered a handmaiden of a princess, right? Of elven royalty. So neither of them are elven royalty. So the Bronwyn Arandir thing being compelling because it's coming at it from a new angle, i.e., they're not a king or a princess or anything like that. If you're familiar with Tolkien's work, you know that that's not true. The Bronwyn Arandir thing is not the first elf-human relationship to be looked at from a non heir to the throne princess sort of perspective. There's Imrazor and Mithralas, right? And I think part of that being aside, the whole status thing. Okay, so Rings of Power does not actually bring a new take on it. You do have your everyday people, i.e., Imrazor and Mithras, um, being in a human elf relationship prior to the show, right? So that means that it's nothing new. It's not special in that regard. But I think they missed the boat because they sell it as a forbidden love, as if there's some outlawing of elf human relationships. But that's never a thing. Again, you have Beren and Luthien elf human relationship. You have Tuor and Idril, okay, human elf relationship. You have Imrazor and Mithralas human elf relationship, and you have Arwen and Aragorn human elf relationship. Now, the thing that they're not playing up with on the show, and that I think where they missed the point, is that these are supposed to be very special, unique things, insofar as we know how elves are quote unquote immortal, right? Elves age at a rate of 144 years to one, right? So one human year, 144 elf years. Okay. If you were to enter into a relationship, say you're a elvish woman and you're entering into a relationship with a human man, right? Even a human man who's of Numenorian descent, and they had the extended lifespans, right? You know it's doomed to heartache. It's doomed to heartache and heartbreak because you will have to watch the person you love grow old and die. It's built into the equation. Okay, there is no happy ending. Right now, you can say Beren and Luthien. Okay, there's extenuating circumstances where they both get sent back as mortals and then live out their lives and die and they're quote unquote buried in an unknown location. Right? Yes, I understand that there's extenuating circumstances, but I'm talking just generally the concept here. The concept here, it's sort of similar to if any of you guys are familiar with the original movie, Highlander, um, and it has that really great soundtrack by the band Queen, and they have that song "Who Wants to Live Forever," and the chorus of that song, or the main line of that song, is "Who wants to live forever when love must die," and the point of that was that in the movie Highlander, he's immortal. Okay, but he falls in love with this woman, and she's not. So, and they sort of do this montage of him watching her grow old and die while he's barely changed at all, right? And the heartbreak and sorrow that brings with it, and I think that's directly sort of what Tolkien, why the human elf relationship is so rare in Middle Earth, right? Is because, barring any special circumstances, right, like in Beren and Luthien's case, it's going to end in heartache and it's going to end in heartbreak. That's sort of why Elrond in Peter Jackson's film and in the books is, he's not opposed to it, but he's not a fan of the idea, right? Of Arwen, falling in love and being with Aragorn, because he knows it's going to end badly for her, right? She's going to watch Aragorn die, grow old and die. She's going to watch their child grow old and die. And ultimately she ends up dying of heartbreak, which is one of the other ways an elf can die, right? And I think that's missed with the Rings of Power. They sort of treat it like, oh, well, hey, the elves are here to watch over your people because your people sided with the bad guys, and therefore you being with Arondir, Bronwyn, that's a no-no because you guys were the bad guys, and there's like sort of no, cavorting with the enemy sort of thing, and that's why it's a forbidden love. You can't be in love with that elf guy because they're the ones that are having to station a garrison here because y'all people are fucking evil, right? And they come at it from that that approach, and I think that that just misses the point. That misses what Tolkien built into why a human elf relationship would be so unique. It would be a rarity. It would be so special because, I mean, if you ask yourselves, if you know, you knew that falling in love with this person was going to lead to nothing but heartbreak, that you would have to watch them grow old and die while you barely changed, right? You've barely aged a day, right? But you've watched them grow old and wither and die. Would that be something you would want to get into? You know? And I think the Bronwyn Arandir storyline misses that point. I think, like, you in the article, they say they're coming at it from like, oh well, they're just peasants, they're just nobodies and stuff like that. Well, Imrazor and Mithralas were also nobodies, so you're not the first ones doing that in Tolkien's universe. Okay, but I think far more important is that there is no forbidden love between elves and humans. It's more of a rarity because of what's involved, because of the nature of elves and the nature of humans. It's almost like you're setting yourself up for heartbreak. And that's what makes it rare. And that's what makes it special when it does happen. Because when it does happen, usually it ends there's some sort of fallout or follow through that comes out of it, that sort of changes the course of history, right? So like Imrazor and Mithralas, right, their children end up being, you have Imrahil, who shows up in Lord of the Rings at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, right? He's the prince of Dal Amroth, right? And he shows up, and he's got part of that elvish blood in him, to the point where Legolas recognizes it. Legolas sees it immediately, like, oh, this dude's got elvish blood in him, right? And then you have sort of like the offspring, and this child has a child who has a child who has a child. So ultimately, what you end up happening is you have uh what's it Finduilas, okay, who is a descendant of, ultimately, of Imrazor and Mithralas, right? After several generations, Finduilas ends up marrying Denethor, who is the steward of Gondor, and they have children, Boromir and Faramir. So one could make the case that there's some elvish blood in Boromir and Faramir. Now, it's a bit of a stretch because there's X amount of generations between, you know, the direct elven blood, but it's there. Okay, and at the same time, Imrahil goes on to have children, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he has a daughter. Hold on, because I had my notes up here. Yes, he has a daughter, Lothiriel, who ends up marrying Eomer of Rohan. So you have this sort of elements of elven blood in both Rohan and Gondor, in the kingdoms of both Rohan and Gondor, at least to the point until, you know, when Aragorn becomes King Elisar, but we know that he's got some elvish blood in there too. So again, the bloodlines have a big impact, and Tolkien lays out, you know, family trees and genealogies and stuff like that. But the point I was trying to make is that I feel like the Rings of Power missed an opportunity where they really could have had something special there if they were going to do it. If they were going to do the human elf relationship thing, they had an opportunity to really make it something special, to drive it home. I mean, if you're going to create one, right, this made up relationship between a human and an elf, at least understand what's involved in it, understand why it's so unique, why it's so special. And I don't think they did. And I think when you see the article, like I read, you know, where they just describe it as, oh, it's got a unique take because they're not, you know, high and mighty and rich and fancy and powerful people. Again, Tolkien did that already in Razor and Mithralas, but you missed the point of why that is such a unique thing. And I'm kind of like a little bummed that like they would miss that, because to me that's always been like a really crucial thing is you know the subtext to a lot of Tolkien's stuff. You've got to read between the lines in a lot of things to fully understand the impact of what's going on. Yes, you could look at Beren and Luthien and say, oh, well, ultimately they ended up both living mortal lives and dying, together per se. But when they started their relationship, that wasn't the case. It's knowing that step into the unknown, that knowing that the odds are stacked against you, that this should by all rights lead to misery and heartache and pain, but there's something about that love for the other person that still carries it forward, that still makes you step into it knowing that there's only one possible outcome. And I think that's what makes Tolkien's elf-human relationships so special. And I'm bummed that the show missed out on that. But anyway, that's just my take on it. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down below. Do you think that whole elf-human thing should have been treated in a better way to make it more of a special, unique sort of thing? Or am I just, overanalyzing Tolkien? I don't know. I've been accused of a lot worse, but let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'm interested. I think it's something that Tolkien fans can discuss, and I think it's a good topic of conversation. I mean, hey, we're talking about love, right? We're talking about love and, interspecies or interracial, you know what I mean? It sort of touches on a whole facet of things, and is your love strong enough that if it's going to end in heartbreak and heartache, is your love in the now strong enough to carry you through till then? And I think it's a good topic. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. If you like the video. If you feel like sharing the video, by all means do so. It gets the word out. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would hope that you would consider subscribing. I think it would help the channel. I think you would enjoy it. And if you have subscribed, I'm glad that you are with us along for the ride and all these interesting conversations. So that's 2 videos today. One where we talk about Tolkien and religious aspects, and one where we're talking about Tolkien and love. So anyway, I look forward to your comments. Until then, be good, be safe, be awesome, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.